Devil May Cry is a game series renowned for its diverse and expressive combat, so it's a bit strange for it to ever really be considered solved. With how many completely unique enemies, bosses, levels, weapons, and abilities these games have, how could you ever pick just one way to solve any individual problem? Well, most people wouldn't. In a game about player expression and freedom, it kinda defeats the point to even attempt to do so. It wasn't always this way though. While Devil May Cry has always been about being stylish, only in the latter half of the series did the true open-ended and artistic nature of the franchise come to fruition. The original Devil May Cry in its 2001 rigidity is a game much more about style in relation to efficiency. Much more martial art than music. Its brutal difficulty, tight resources, and unforgiving combat often requires solving what I like to call the puzzle of Devil May Cry 1. The original Devil May Cry is a unique case of a game, inspired directly from the very public world of arcade cabinets. Since the beginning, the game was built for the player to show off, hence the stylish nature to the game's aesthetic. However, pure aesthetics are not often the best way to inspire awe. What does drop draws, however, is a stylish approach added to a high level of competency. That is to say, if the goal is to make people who are watching you play say, "Wow, that was so cool," doing something flashy alone isn't the best way to do it. Instead, showing them that what you are doing is difficult and then tackling that difficulty with style is what gives that wow factor. For anyone who's actually played the first Devil May Cry, the difficulty is immediately apparent. While it's no Dark Souls, the game is certainly punishing, and overcoming its many combat encounters without taking damage, quickly and efficiently, is inherently impressive. The game's protagonist Dante has this laid-back but confident personality, as if nothing in the game could possibly stop him. And when the player embodies this character, the goal is to feel the same way. The game knows this and has meticulously designed the combat in order for it to be solvable. Devil May Cry 1 is unique in this way, as almost every enemy in the game has one or multiple built-in weaknesses, instant kill counter moves, or AI looping stun locks. You might hesitate to think that these are intentional, but the majority of them are built into the game's notes system, where Dante meticulously marks down observations about each enemy, plotting a way to capitalize on each one's unique weaknesses. Of course, in addition to the ones that are in this book, the community has found many more advanced strategies over the years to turn nearly every combat encounter in the game into a solved puzzle. The game itself wants you to learn to solve this puzzle, with each encounter increasing or slightly altering the difficulty and testing your knowledge of both enemy weaknesses and Dante's moveset. In fact, performing well in Devil May Cry 1 is much more about what you know than how well you can execute it. This knowledge gap is how the game trickle feeds the player information about how to solve said puzzles. In this video, I'm going to break down and showcase some of the ways that DMC1's combat teaches you to solve it, and by extension, the ways that its players have learned to perfect it. From regular enemies to mini-bosses, and then later in the video, the bosses themselves. The first mission is a perfect example of this slow introduction. The only enemies in this level are marionettes. These are easily the most versatile and also the most manipulatable enemies in the entire game. But even on the first playthrough, you have everything you need to completely make a joke of these first combat encounters, even on the hardest difficulty. The marionettes themselves come in a variety of colors, blue, green, purple, and red, in ascending health order, with each enemy's health being a random number somewhere in the range of possible outcomes for that color. So while blues always will have less health than purples, some purples can have massively more health than other purples. On top of this, they also have randomly assigned weapons, all with unique movesets, from watermelon blades to daggers and even the blicky. Each of these weapons have their own weaknesses and strengths, and when going into combat with a group of marionettes, the player never knows what exactly to expect. This may seem counterproductive when talking about the puzzle-solving nature of Devil May Cry 1's combat. Having the first enemy be so random surely makes it harder for an inexperienced player to come to grips with what control they have over the battlefield. But au contraire, the randomness actually enforces this learning structure. At this point in the game, the player can only have one melee weapon, no additional moves, and one gun. Well, two guns, but you know what I mean. This is perfect, as the marionettes are the most reactionary enemies in the game, meaning the player's ability to control them within the combat is higher than it will ever be. This teaches universal rules, like the third hit of the main combo knocking the enemy away, or that using high time can launch enemies in the air. Guns can juggle enemies, and pause combos can extend combat and create a bigger area of effect. The fact that the enemies have different movesets but all react the same to your actions reinforces the idea that these attributes to your moves are universal, with only slight variations depending on the context. For example, red marionettes have a random chance to block your attacks. However, they can only do this with their feet on the ground, so if you launch the enemy in the air with high time and then juggle them with the guns, they can never block, and basically don't ever get to play the game. Not only does the game allow this, it explicitly rewards it by building your stylish meter very quickly and rewarding the player with more orbs. However, this is just a strategy that a new player could relatively come up with on the fly, or at least one that people end up using pretty regularly when they're new. This, of course, leaves some holes. It's not a true solution to the puzzle. There's usually more than one marionette in an encounter at a time, and it can be tricky at times to maintain a juggle. Truly solving the puzzle requires some more advanced game knowledge. It can definitely benefit from more moves and abilities. As we've discussed, marionettes are a tutorial, and as such, they are the most exploitable enemy in the game. They teach you about the universal properties of your tools. This means that once you have more tools, you'll have even more ways to exploit them. The guns, all of them, completely destroy the marionettes. Ebony and Ivory can be shot really fast by just pressing the shoot button fast, and this is a really safe way to kill all the marionettes from a distance. The shotgun blasts them all over and crowd controls like crazy, and they have absolutely no counter for this. The grenade gun instant kills them. No, I'm not joking. It instant kills all marionettes except for the very highest health pool purples and reds. And Nightmare Beta also stun locks them and kills most of them in one shot as well. Then you have your additional abilities. Stinger throws them across the room and does insane damage. Air Raid makes you basically invincible. Vortex makes you literally invincible. And Inferno instant kills everything and has crazy crowd control. These applications of the more advanced tools are all exploits of the same basic reactions that the core combat kit teaches you. So yeah, while they may seem like the hardest to solve at first due to their complexity, their pure malleability and low health makes them easy to deal with when you have the right tools. But if it's really all about knowledge, then it shouldn't matter what tools you have. So what strategies can you use to solve these encounters if you don't have all your tools? Well, the best strategy is to maintain a juggle so the enemies can't fight back. But a strict juggle with Ebony and Ivory won't do. It only launches and juggles one enemy at a time, and leaves you vulnerable to those around you. Instead, we employed this alternate juggle. After launching in the air instead of shooting, we start the first two hits of the normal combo. This also juggles the enemy in the air, but has a wider range of effect, allowing it to hit multiple enemies at the same time, stunning any other marionettes in that direction. Then we follow up with another high time to relaunch the marionette, keeping him in the air. This has the added effect of having the possibility to launch multiple marionettes. The more juggled at a time, the better, as it eliminates the possibility that they block or grab us in between our slashes. This can be repeated until all of the enemies are dead. It's not a perfect solution. The marionettes being so dynamic and you having so few tools at the time guarantees that. The actual perfect solution is to sit on the other side of the room and spam Ebony and Ivory. It only leaves you vulnerable to long range attacks, and all of these have very distinct audio cues that make them pretty simple to dodge. This strategy is kind of boring and not very stylish though, and the game knows this, so it's only viable for situations where you want the utmost of consistency. The game itself punishes this behavior. For example, when I completed my run of all special bonuses in a row for the entire game, it required me to get an insanely high orb count on every mission while taking no damage. And on mission 1, this was impossible if I played it safe and shot my way to the end. As the style meter punished me for not using varied attacks, it basically dropped the orb drops from these enemies to 0, essentially requiring me to do a strategy that wasn't perfectly consistent to achieve the best rank. But this leaves a very specific combat encounter scenario as one of the only combat encounters in the entire game that isn't perfectly solvable. And that's only in a new game scenario when trying to accomplish the utmost of perfection. These very overarching rules would then be tested again in the next combat encounters on mission 2, with more marionette fights until the final encounter where this expectation would be subverted with the arrival of the Sin Scissors. Up to this point, every enemy was weak to a ton of different options, but certain options had special advantages that the player could take advantage of if they paid attention. The Sin Scissors had the exact opposite approach. At first, they seem impossible, a floating cloak that can go through walls and threatens to cut Dante's luscious locks. Any attempts to hit the thing are futile. Your sword slashes go right through it, and trying to blast it with the blicky crashes harder than a Led Zeppelin. This forces the player to change how they approach the combat. Before, they could do whatever they want and get some results. But now, if they wanted to get anywhere, they would have to think more carefully about what outcomes they desired. Sin Scissors only take damage to the masks. Any hit to the body will go straight through, making essentially every hit a sort of puzzle to be solved. How do you hit what cannot be touched? Well, mostly by waiting for an opening and countering. Sin Scissors are vulnerable just before and just after they attack. Unlike marionettes, dealing damage doesn't come easy, so when you get a chance, you better capitalize. What the game has taught us so far is that the sword is the best way to have a large impact. But that's not working, so what now? Well, at first, we should focus on not dying. Rolling to dodge here is pretty ineffective because of the camera angle, so you're practically forced to jump. This pushes the player into a scenario that they probably haven't explored before this point. You're in the air, but your guns are pretty useless. This forces the player to explore the aerial combat with the sword, of which you only have one option, a heavy downward slash called Helmbreaker. This deals a massive blow that's met with feedback to match. And sometimes this can even instantly kill. This flow works perfectly to teach the player to search for specific solutions, and lets them know that they will be rewarded for their attention to detail. This is just a basic way of approaching the puzzle though, and with a bit more game knowledge, you can really capitalize on these openings. Helmbreaker does more damage the more height you fall from, and adds a 2x damage multiplier if you double jump. So by double jumping into a Helmbreaker, you could add some consistency to the instant kill. This is a relatively perfect solution to these enemies, with them not really being able to do anything about it. For those who are really paying attention to the details though, when experimenting, you might discover that when you would try to attack the enemy while it's winding up its own attack, that you can actually parry the scissor, leaving them massively open to a counter. If you, in this time, go up and shoot them in the mask directly, they instantly die. This is a built-in perfect counter that drops additional orbs on death. Not only does Dante note this weakness when you counter the enemy in the journal, but actually the entire first secret mission is dedicated to teaching the player about this not-so-hidden mechanic. The genius of this critical hit is that it's just an extension of how you normally fight the enemy, waiting for an opening and then countering. So it doesn't require you to change the philosophy of the fight to go for the crit, but it does require you to change the context in which you apply this philosophy. You're also rewarded handsomely with a ton of extra orbs for hitting this critical kill. A skilled player can stand in the middle of the room and just one by one counter all the scissors, farming orbs all day. It's not even really that hard, it just requires a bit of game knowledge. It of course is not the only solution though. In this very room that the Sin Scissors are introduced in, you can also find the shotgun, which when equipped can do some fantastic crowd control on the scissors and can build an incredible amount of style. This can provide a 100% safe option for dealing with these enemies if you're willing to experiment. Marionettes and Sin Scissors represent the two core philosophies of enemy design in Devil May Cry 1. Open-ended and expressive, and rigid and structured. Every enemy in the rest of the game, including the bosses, will fall in between these two categories. More expressive enemies will allow a much higher level of freedom when it comes to how you approach them, but there will be far fewer one-size-fits-all solutions. Whereas the more rigid enemies will have way less ways to counter them, but those counters are often absolute and unrelenting. Let's jump to mission 4 for a bit and break down the enemy that I feel like is most perfectly in the middle. The Shadow. Shadow presents the player with the most dynamic and frantic experience that the game has to offer. In your first encounter with him, he instantly jumps in the air and throws himself at you as the cutscene ends, barely leaving you any time to react. This puts you on the back foot as he aggressively takes large chunks out of your health bar. Most people's immediate reaction is to fight back, of course, but when you do so, you are met with tragedy. A parried blow, and an instant undodgeable counter that hits you for chip damage and stun. It's apparent right away that using your sword just won't do, so the next logical conclusion would be to try your guns. At least, that's what you would try if you didn't instantly die like most people do here. Once you make the run back to try guns, this actually works to your benefit in keeping some distance. Pelting away at him with the guns appears to have resulted in not much of anything happening at all. Until all of a sudden you hear a screech and it stops moving. A glowing orb appears and spins in place. Something is obviously different, so you go to hit it with your sword and it seems to be dealing damage. After a few moments, the core closes and we're back to business as usual. Do this one more time, and after hitting the core, it turns red, and something about the beast changes. Instead of straight up attacking you, it tries to eat you, chasing you down even more relentlessly than before. Before you know it, it swallows you whole, eventually exploding, taking you with it. You won, but at what cost? Shadow perfectly encapsulates this idea of puzzle-like combat. This is a somewhat amorphous, hard-to-read enemy that requires the player to jump between rigid and free-flow combat states in real time. On the surface, it's quite simple. The beginning is rigid, forcing the player to evade and use guns to break down its shield before exposing its core. Then the player is in free-form mode. You can do any attack you want to the core, and all attacks are a good solution. Then, once the core closes, you return to a rigid structure, repeating this process until the fight is over. This creates a fight that is far more dynamic than most in the game, one where there is an ebb and flow to the combat. Neither you nor the Shadow have complete control over the dynamic. There are both moments where you must run and moments where you can take the fight to the beast. This works perfectly in the context of this part of the game because you've already been exposed to both types of enemies, and even tested with the first boss fight. Shadow then takes those two types of gameplay and forces you to switch between them in real time. It does this by placing restrictions for what sort of interactions you can have with the beast, depending on what part of the fight you're in. It's a relatively simple gimmick, but it works flawlessly. If that was the entirety of the ways you could fight it though, it wouldn't be so important for this video. The real reason it's the best combat encounter in the game is that there are many possible solutions, and a lot of those solutions are the inverse to the ones that you normally do. Let's break down the mechanics a bit. Shadow has 2 health bars, one for his shield that must be broken before the core is revealed, and then one for the core. On top of this, the enemy's AI depends entirely upon the way you act towards it. Attacking it causes it to get aggressive. So conversely, by shooting his shield, you bait him into attacking you over and over again. And just standing around causes him to be far more passive and predictable. The shield at a first glance seems to only take damage to guns, but this isn't true. Sure, you do get parried when you try to attack it with your sword, but you can only be parried if you don't have double trigger active. If you activate it, you'll still take chip damage, but you won't stun. This actually makes it so you can break the shield with your sword instead of with the guns, opening up an alternative option and allowing you to dictate the pace of the combat yourself. It comes with its drawbacks for sure, but especially when fighting multiple shadows at the same time, being able to take the fight to them creates a whole new layer of control, and it is derived from flipping the status quo on its head. When you normally let him dictate the way you play, you can instead go for a higher risk strategy that allows you to flip it into a free-form combat moment. This can be used to destroy his shield very quickly, and then instantly put him into a self-destruct mode. On top of this, you can choose to fight him by being even more rigid, but in an aggressive way, instead of a passive one. By walking slowly and baiting out a skewer attack, you can jump on the Shadow's spear. This locks him in place, allowing you to counter him and getting a critical kill, similarly to how you do with the Sin Scissors. While you're on the spear, a new health bar arises, and if you're able to get it to 0, then you'll instantly get him into the self-destruct phase, skipping the core phase entirely. This can be done with many methods, but by far the easiest is shooting with Ebony and Ivory. What makes this enemy so special is that while it appears very rigid, there are a ton of amazing and unique ways to combat the enemy. And if played at a high level, you can take the fight in basically any direction that you want. Including getting him to yeet himself out of the map, killing him instantly. Although I think this one is a little bit less intended than some of the others. So now we have an example of a free flow enemy design, a rigid enemy design, and something in between. Let's do a speed round of the rest of the basic enemies and mini bosses in the game and show a variety of ways to solve their puzzles. Sin Scissors of course can be parried, but their cousins Sin Scythes can actually die in one charge shot blast. Underwater Skulls, Sargasso, also get blasted by the Blicky in one shot. You can get a clean double kill on them to quickly and safely end this combat encounter. Nobodies have a mask that when broken keeps them permanently in a small state. Using air raid 3 times breaks the mask. They also take 3 times damage from double trigger grenade launcher shots, and completely can be stun locked if you cancel the recovery from shooting the grenade launcher with a roll. On top of that, you can hit them with whatever the hell this is to stun lock them until they die. In fact, most enemies in the game can be stun locked if you just roll cancel the grenade launcher over and over again. Death Scissors need to be hit hard many times in order to die, but after a certain amount of damage taken, they always fly off camera and swoop at Dante over and over. You can tell what direction he's going to come from if you hold lock on and look where Dante is aiming. Once you know where he's coming from, you can always just roll on the scream and it makes it free to dodge every attack. If you're not really sure though, the Vortex move makes you completely invincible while you hold it down, and by holding right trigger you can override the lock on for the attack, allowing you to just do it in any direction to dodge incoming damage. These attack phases can be completely avoided though by just instant killing the Death Scissor. A triple jump double triggered Helm Breaker to the face does a ton of damage. If you then follow this up with another one, but this time from behind, you get flanking blow damage, which does another 1.5 times damage, and instantly kills the mini boss before he gets to do anything. If that's a little bit too difficult to pull off and you're on New Game Plus, you can always just use Meteor with the Ifrit attack to instantly kill the enemy in one hit. You can also use Inferno to get all your Devil Trigger back instantly. Death Sights work in a very similar way. They have 2,500 health, but they can't drop below 500 with a single hit. This is a bit harder to manage before he flies away, so in speedruns at least, we often time a Holy Water in a way that hits him twice, instantly killing him. If that isn't sufficient though, because you hate items, and me, then there is another setup that vortexes him once and then double Helm Breakers to kill him before he gets the chance to fly away. Frost can be hard countered by pretty much every Ifrit super move. A Kick 13 and Inferno do the job, but if that's not safe enough for you, Meteor is also very good. If for some godforsaken reason you want to fight these things without Ifrit, doing a high time into a Helm Breaker breaks their ice armor and makes the subsequent hits do about 2 times damage, and it can stun lock them. Speaking of lizards, the warm-blooded versions of Frost's blades have a built-in counter just like scissors. If you knock them on their back and then do a Helm Breaker, you instantly kill them. This also drops a ton more orbs than an ordinary kill. Also, if you break their shield, you do 1.5 times damage until they get their shield back. Clyclops pretty much just can't hit you if you spam Air Raid, and just about everything in the game is stun locked if you spam Grenade Gun and Stinger. So as you can see, basically every basic enemy type in the game has at least one hard counter, and most have way more than one. This makes Devil May Cry's combat encounters uniquely perfectible, and with relative ease. That is at least until we get to the bosses, where it's a bit more difficult to flex with just knowledge alone. Phantom, the game's first, second, fourth, and fifth boss, is definitely the simplest of the bosses, but countering him isn't always the easiest. He's only vulnerable to attacks directly in his face or on his back. He's a big boy, and he's in control of this encounter. It's not like you can just launch him in the air and juggle him. So the trick here is to learn his dance, and it's easiest to do this when you can decide when he gets to attack. Which, spoilers if you're really good, is never. Phantom has a critical hit location on that big dumpy of his, so if you double jump and then DT Helmbreaker his boy hole, he takes massive damage. On normal, you only have to do this 4 times and he's donezo. This is aided by the fact that when you do enough stun damage to Phantom, he gets a set reaction. When stunned, he'll always walk forward without turning directions for a few seconds. This makes it so you can repeatedly hit his abdomen by setting him up so that he walks into a wall. On Dante Must Die, he takes many more hits to kill, even with the critical hit. But you can keep him walking into the wall over and over again by looping this stun. Let's say you're more of a normal person, one who doesn't want to grind Phantom for more hours than a full-time job just so he can't play the game. What can you do to take control of the fight? Well, using Stinger or High Time on his face will actually interrupt every attack that he can do, as long as he hasn't been stunned just a few seconds prior. You can tell if he's going to be able to be stunned based on the way that his lava glows while he's doing the attack. This opens him up for some pretty interesting loops. That one is quite difficult. The bosses require a lot of knowledge, but that won't be enough. The strategies required to counter and lock down the bosses in this game also require a high level of execution. Well, at least they do for that boss. The next one, not so much. All of the hallway phantoms are perfectly countered by just spamming Vortex. You are literally invincible when this move is active, and you shred the boss's health. That'll make him think twice before he chases us down a hallway. The final encounter with Phantom is exactly the same mechanically as the first, so there isn't a whole lot to add here. But he does have a secret extra method that you can use to kill him that's much easier than the ones we had before. The window in the floor actually takes damage every time the boss jumps on it, and after a few times it can break and this happens. Yeah, it instantly kills the boss.
Sweet dreams.
Speedrunning side note, if you get perfect luck, this is actually faster than a perfect fight using the boy hole blasting method on Dante Must Die. So we've stomped some spiders, but what about the more complicated bosses? Well, Nello Angelo is the first of the more formidable foes. He's designed to not be someone you can just push around. He's supposed to be somewhat like your equal, and has lots of tools to break out of any sort of loop that you can get him into. After being hit a certain number of times, he will automatically parry you and start to counterattack. This means there isn't a super simple way to loop him. Instead, we have to manipulate his AI to open him up for something a bit more complicated. By doing the extended combo, we can loop it twice for a bit of damage, but any more hits will cause a counter. So instead of attacking, we're going to jump backwards and bait out a meteor attack. This opens him up to be instantly comboed again. Simply loop to end the fight. This strategy actually works perfect for both the first and second Nello Angelo fights, But by the time you get to the second one, a faster option is available. With Ifrit, we use Inferno and then kick 13, and then punch his block to break it. We then loop with the grenade gun to completely feed little brother his Fruit Loops. This will help kill him a little bit faster because the damage is increased every time you do a loop. The third fight, on the other hand, will actually require doing this method, because his third phase, he likes to teleport away, and if you don't stay super in his face, he has a chance to break this loop. If he does manage to escape though, jumping into him with Rolling Blaze actually brings him down from the air and cancels any projectiles he might have thrown. With little brother fed his Fruit Loops, let's make our way to the bird. Griffin is by far the boss you have the least control of, as he just flies around the entire arena doing whatever the fuck he wants. Thankfully, all of his attacks have very consistent methods of dodging. You can't AI manipulate him like you can Nello Angelo, but it's not at all necessary. Simply blasting away at the bird when he lands is good enough. If you want a strategy that has a little bit more punch, using Meteor at the right time can cause it to hit twice, dealing massive damage. Aiming for him when he leans forward will achieve this. That is to say, if you even really want to fight him. The first boss is entirely optional. You can just pick up Ifrit and then leave. In the second encounter, he is much more manipulatable. The bird tends to stay in the air, but you can force him to land if you counter his projectile that tries to launch you and then stand here. This triggers Griffin to land, and then by climbing on the beams of the ship, you can get out of range of his attacks and rain hell from above. On higher difficulties, this won't be enough to kill in just one cycle, but by jumping onto him and then waiting for him to do it again, you can simply loop and finish it in 2 cycles. Third encounter is more of the same from the first, but he's got a lot more health. This is definitely one of the least solvable fights in the game. It is consistent and can be perfected for sure, but it's not so simple. This brings us to Nightmare, who seems like at first is a complete random mess of a boss, but is actually the most deterministic enemy in the entire game. He is massively complicated, so I'm going to save the detailed breakdown for another video, but let's just say his attacks entirely depend on where you are in the arena, and you can simply destroy him with some well-timed Ifrit punches and Rolling Blaze to counter the spear attack. In the very final fight with Nightmare on Mission 20, he is a last chance phase, which goes absolutely bonkers. This seems like it would have no good counter, but actually there's a couple that are really safe. If you air raid and then spin in circles around the arena, he'll never hit you. Or you could just spam Vortex to make sure you have invincibility frames the entire time. Or simply wait for the lasers to come at you and then grenade gun roll in between each laser. The timing will always be the same. This only leaves Mundus, who in my opinion breaks the rules a little bit. Bosses are all about testing the player on what they've learned up to this point. And with Mundus being the final boss, he is the final test. And I think the philosophy here is that while the rest of the game is entirely solvable, Mundus is not so much. You're playing an odds game here. This is especially so in the second phase, but the first iteration of this boss flips the script entirely. Everyone hates this boss, but there are a few things that you can do that make it much easier. For one, if you press the melee button, you do Vortex, and this not only does damage to the boss when he dives at you, but can also give you a ton of invincibility frames, allowing you to use it as a dodge button. On top of this, you can shoot as fast as you can press the shoot button here, and there are 2 shoot buttons. On PC, I would recommend setting up a macro function to melt the damn boss before he even gets a chance to move. The second fight, while back to traditional gameplay, is much less fair. There are optimal counters and plays to everything that can happen, but at the end of the day, if you're exposed to enough attacks long enough, you'll eventually run into a situation that's impossible to counter. Mundus then tests your endurance and your adaptability. Basically, he layers multiple different types of attacks on top of each other, and they can just so happen to layer in a way that makes them undodgeable. Even so, he does have some things that are super good against him. For example, using the shotgun to break all of his yellow orbs that shoot arrows at you. This is super good and basically essential if you want to have a good fight against him. Then you can combine Round Trip, throwing your sword at him, and Meteor to stack damage in a way that does an absolute massive impact on the boss fight. The deeper you get into the boss fight though, the faster he's going to layer these attacks, and the more likely it is that you're going to be put in a situation that is practically unwinnable. One attack that people always seem to think that you have no counter for though is this one where he gets these white balls and shoots them at you. You can actually reflect all of these if you hit them with your sword while in Devil Trigger. This is one of the easiest ways to get a massive amount of damage. The only problem is sometimes these boulders can be in the way and they explode and that debris attacks you randomly. And that's basically the entire game. You have a lot of options when it comes to how you're going to approach the combat in Devil May Cry 1. And there's a lot of ways that you can make this game your bitch. Devil May Cry 1 is a uniquely solvable game, and at this point, we've gotten pretty close to nearly perfecting it. I, for one, have been able to get a special bonus, the perfect rank, which requires no damage on every single mission consecutively on the normal difficulty. Only thing left to do is on Dante Must Die, and at that point, I'm sure we'll find more ways to master the game. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and thank you so much to my patrons who've been supporting me over a long period of time. If you want to watch any of my speedruns or challenge runs of the Devil May Cry games, you can find them over on the WaifuRuns Archives YouTube channel. I also live stream over there pretty often. I'm taking a quick break for a minute here, but I'll be back sooner rather than later. Thanks so much again, and I appreciate you.